Welcome. Today we are going to talk about Rene Descartes. He's one of those pivotal figures in the history of philosophy, where beginning with him is kind of where we begin the early modern philosophical period. We kind of have some transitions with some people like Occam, who's definitely on the late side of medieval, and Scotus and those sorts. But by the time we get to Descartes, we are clearly entering into a new era of philosophy. Following Descartes, we will get people like Hume and Kant and Hegel, who are all kind of building one off of another in some sort of like domino effect. Descartes becomes kind of that key figure that shifts some of the aim of philosophy and really kind of begins in a place that Aristotle and others began, with notions of doubt. So enjoy our discussion today on Descartes. Rene Descartes is definitely one of those pivotal figures. Born 1596, will die in 1650. He's French, he remains Catholic, and was educated at Jesuit schools, but would be friends with many different Protestants. He was definitely not reactionary in one way or the other. In fact, the school of thought that kind of surrounds him is notions of rationalism. And rationalism, generally, regards reason as the chief source and test of our knowledge, that we can use reason to be able to understand things. Usually within the broader concept of rationalism, you have a couple of different theses that are adopted, like the intuition deduction thesis, where some propositions in a particular area are knowable to us by intuition alone, while others are knowable and deduced by different intuitive propositions. So sometimes we're kind of able to know, and sometimes we know because we know other things that kind of lead us to that idea, right? We're able to deduce things from our intuition. Or conversely, things like the innate knowledge thesis, that we'll have some knowledge about some things in a particular area just because of our rational nature, because we're able to reason, we're able to kind of perceive something, because we have some sort of knowledge inside of us as rational creatures that's able to give us this information. Or there's also this idea that instead of just innate knowledge, maybe there's innate concepts that are able to be there, that we have some concepts that we're able to employ in a particular area as a part of our rational nature. Within all of these different broad ideas is that you have something inside of yourself. You, as a rational creature, are able to understand certain concepts or aspects of the world, and therefore you're not abandoned or without clue, right? You don't really come off with a blank slate for a rationalist. You come out with reason, which is powerful and is able to help you understand a few things with the world. Now, as I mentioned, Descartes becomes kind of the big figure for this school of thought, and this kind of really pushes things beyond where they were before within that sort of scholastic realm. I mean, there are definitely going to be some, of those in the scholastic era which will lead to this idea and even held some of these notions, but weren't really as clear as this in formulating their concepts as Descartes is. Descartes was a rather interesting fellow who had a very interesting life. As I already mentioned, he'll end up being surrounded by people who don't necessarily believe what he does during an era where this was rather important. He'll even leave France and go and take a job for Queen Christina of Sweden, a very Protestant Lutheran nation, and here he is, a French Catholic. Right, we're going to know throughout history that this might cause some problems. I mean, all the more if we really kind of think about Descartes living during the 30 Years' War, where Sweden and France are two of the major opponents against each other. And yet here he is, he's living in and through all of that. He will, by the way, serve in different armies. He'll serve for the Netherlands, Bavaria, and Hungary, but really kind of was much more a philosopher than any sort of warrior. He'll found analytic geometry as well as believed notions that science and philosophy should be one. In many ways, Descartes could be seen as kind of a return to some of those pre-Socratics, where philosophy was a tool and an instrument in understanding not just politics or ethics, but also the way that the universe and everything in it works and operates. And so again, we have this neat sort of idea connected with Descartes. His death, by the way, is overly tragic and somewhat comical as well. He will end up accepting a job, as I mentioned, from Queen Christina of Sweden, and be her philosophy tutor. I mean, who would be better to teach you philosophy during this time than Descartes, right? Descartes really liked to sleep in, as many of you might as well, but the Queen decided that she was brightest and able to absorb philosophical knowledge early, so early that it was 5:30 in the morning. And so Descartes would have to, in service to the Queen, wake up early and walk around a cold, oftentimes dank castle in Sweden to go and prepare himself to be the tutor for the Queen. One of those mornings was so cold and etc. that he would actually catch pneumonia and die prematurely in the winter of 1650. Right, so there becomes this sort of tragedy associated with his death, right? That he didn't want to wake up early, probably really didn't belong in Sweden, just historically speaking, and ends up being in Sweden and waking up early and dying. So there's at least one example of that sort of thing happening. His main sort of quote that we all know from Descartes is that whole "I think, therefore." All right, it's that rational nature once again. I think, therefore I am, or I think, therefore I am a thing which thinks. That tells me at least something about me, that I'm a thinking thing, that I have this rational nature and character. The goal of knowledge for Descartes is certainty. It's to be certain and to actually know something. And this certainty requires not just doubt, but a systematic doubt where we're going to weigh out our thoughts and our impressions and our presuppositions against what he thinks is really real. In fact, we even get this sort of idea that you should never accept anything as true unless it is clearly and inescapably so. So what is reality then for Descartes? If we need to never accept anything as true unless it's clearly and inescapably so, Descartes believes that reality is made up of two things, mind and matter. Right? Matter is the extension of space and time. It is the outer world. It is literally space, physical notions of matter. It constitutes the mechanisms of the world. It is a machine that is set in motion by God. And it continued in motion due to its own inherent and necessary laws of nature. In many ways, right, this is kind of the Platonic idea of matter, but added in with a Catholic twist, as Descartes remained Catholic, even though, again, surrounded by Lutherans and other sorts of Protestants, but also one that operates and continues on its own. It's not just a further emanation, as we'll get to with Neoplatonic thought or anything else like that, but the material world moves and functions. Instead of it being the realm of ideas, though, we start to connect to this notion of mind for Descartes. Now, most of our medieval philosophers wouldn't use the term mind except for thinkings of the functions of the mind, and would prefer notions of the soul that has some sort of larger idea. But for Descartes, he's going to extend a little bit of this discussion of the mind as this inner world, as our own consciousness. He says that the mind is free and yet also motivated by God. Again, very much following arguments from Augustine that we talked about earlier. In it, we have two guiding principles for our mind. The first is intuition. This is the undoubting conception of an unclouded and attentive mind. Right? So it's this new conceptions in your mind when you're focused on things and not distracted by others. It is not a fluctuating testimony of the senses, nor a misleading judgment that proceeds from some sort of blundering constructions of imagination. Now, it's interesting, he's got this notion of imagination, of kind of being the blundering sort of ideas. Later, when we get to people like Hume, imagination becomes a lot more important. But for Descartes, no, intuition is reasoned thinking. It's, again, pulling out of that reasonable and unclouded and attentiveness that exists in your mind. The other way that the mind functions is through deduction, as I already mentioned, right? We understand all necessary inference from other facts that are known with certainty, right? We're able to deduce and understand like things fitting into a puzzle, how one thing works towards the other. And we're able to move and expand this sort of discussion here. Often this involves a long series of transitions from ground, from what is known, to the consequent, to the next sort of level up, and then maybe multiple times, right? We might even have difficulty in recalling the whole route in which we arrived at the conclusion that we did. We just know that this is the conclusion at this point. And so this becomes the sort of constructions of the mind. The first principles of the mind are always given by intuition alone, while the contrary, the remote conclusions, are furnished usually, really always, by deduction, right? That we are able to infer how things are, and then we deduce them. We use our rational mind to do this. Now, generally speaking, broadly speaking, for Descartes, there are these two guiding principles, these two substances in our world. But one, as a good Catholic and a big fan of Aquinas, Descartes really adds in a third notion of what reality consists in. And this is God. That God is also present in this world. God is absolute substance, uncreated, unmoved, the perfect creator of matter and human minds. He is the first cause, right? All the stuff that Aquinas says in the 5 ways. This is God. Everything else that Aquinas would say in the Summa, Descartes would largely agree with as well. So again, we have mind, we have matter, but we also have this outside sort of force, for a broad, idea, that isn't really a substance in this world, and this world can move and operate on its own logistics, but every once in a while there's something else introduced into it by this unmoved creator, the unmoved mover, who might have started the whole cosmic machine running. Descartes walks us through the whole rationalization process and what we're able to understand about the nature of the universe and his notions of systematic doubt in his work called the Meditations, broken up into multiple kind of books or arguments, Meditation 1, 2, and so forth. Meditation 1 begins, some years ago I was struck by how many false things I had believed, and by how doubtful was the structure of beliefs that I had based on them. Right? This whole idea of the inference and deduction, kind of, wait a second, I was deducing things off of false precepts, I need to move forward, right? I realized that if I wanted to establish anything in the sciences that was stable and likely to last, I needed to try once in my life to demolish everything completely and start again from the foundations. And he's going to destroy everything, and he's going to start building up again from whatever foundation is left in this. All I need for the purpose of rejecting all of my opinions is to find in each of them at least some reason for doubt. So he's going to be very systematic about this. If there's any slight notion of doubt that can exist that's, reasonable, then he's going to throw it out. And we might build it back up and include it later on, but he's going to start by trying to really strip it down to just the frame, just, what is it that's concrete that will not get destroyed. So this is his starting, right? If you have any doubt in an idea, you should reject it until you can prove that it is true. It's kind of his starting point, which is really some heavy lifting to do. He's going to start with the basic principles on which all of his former beliefs rested. Wherever I have accepted until now is the most true, has come to me through my senses. Right? So this is his starting point. Whatever I've accepted as true, I've always done through by looking, by observing, right? It's from the outside. And again, rationalism can kind of build up on a sort of critique of this, but this is what most of us start off with as true. I saw it, therefore I believe it's true. I heard it, therefore I believe that it's true. Right? We have all had some sort of sense experience, though, that deceives us. You would all agree with this, right? So we need to start by getting rid of everything that has come to us by our senses. Those need to leave. How do you know, for instance, that you're not asleep right now? Right? In fact, Descartes liked to sleep. How do you know right now this isn't some sort of big elaborate dream? Some of you think, I hope I've got more exciting dreams. But some dreams are mundane. Some dreams are, you're just going over this. Maybe you're really excited about Descartes and philosophy, and maybe this is your dream. How do you know that that's not the case? Do you know? Go ahead and think for a moment. How do I know I'm not dreaming right now? Don't just pinch yourself. I know some of you are, no. Because, your dream, pinching yourself in a dream would hurt just as much as not, possibly. How can you trust anything that you've observed? How can we trust science? It's a very, common phrase right now, why I trust science or whatever. But first of all, science isn't a guy. There's not a single guy, a lab coat, beaker or whatever. Hey, I'm science. Right? No, science is debate, discussion. It's ripping down ideas and really should be following what Descartes is saying here. Now, we might have said, oh, I've concluded on this, but now you're believing somebody else in their observations. Right? Is science something foundational? Descartes would say no. Because again, it's perception. It's based on perception. So it needs to be eliminated as well, right? It's different observations, and so that is at least somewhat suspect. Now, they might be experts. They might be well regarded. But it's still based on observations that could rationally and reasonably be incorrect. After all, we've seen science change all the time. In the middle of the 20th century, the argument was quit having butter, have margarine. A bunch of trans fats, really not good for you. Don't breastfeed your children, give them formula, right? Don't have eggs, do have eggs, back and forth, right? All sorts of different things coming out as far as how you should live and what you should eat and what the right sort of best way of living a human life is. Getting rid of what had worked for thousands of years for ideas that sounded good, but they were scientific, and therefore they're better, right? And now most of these things, and our list of those can grow, we kind of laugh at or kind of go, yeah, that was a little bit bad. And different sorts of ideas move and spin and churn, and therefore Descartes says that shouldn't be the foundation of what we could build on. While it might be good, it might even be right, it's at least dubious and therefore needs to go out. Descartes even pushes this beyond just, a perception could be wrong as we see something that isn't real or hear something that isn't real. He says, what if my understanding of them is corrupted by an evil God? I would have no senses that I could trust at all, and I couldn't even count to 2 without being in doubt. Because again, if everything is pushed and moved and corrupted, how do you know what you should do? Right? Some sort of cunning demon, he says, that it might want to deceive you. And therefore, all of the colors of the sky and everything else could be wrong and destroyed and distorted. And then you go right back into those old ways. How do you know any of these things that you observe can be true? Descartes says we really got to start shedding a lot of that away to find something that we know we can hold on to. Continues in meditation 2. He says, yesterday's meditation raised doubts, ones that are too serious to be ignored, which I can in no way see resolving. I will set aside anything that admits of the slightest doubt, treating it as though I had found it to be outright false. Right, so this becomes the idea here. If I can have the slightest bit of doubt in it, I'm going to just pretend that it's false. I'm going to move from there, which is, again, a fairly extreme sort of thought. Continuing on, I will carry on that until I can find something that is certain, or worse, until I become certain that there is no certainty. Archimedes said that if he had one firm and immovable point, he could lift the whole world with a long enough lever. So too I can hope for great things if I manage to find just one little thing that is solid and certain. So this becomes the idea, is that we need to lift the whole world. We need to lift our thoughts, our reasons, our life, our experience with a long enough lever that's based upon at least one firm point that's going to let us move and lift it. So after thoroughly thinking of the matter through, I concluded, he says, that this proposition, I am, I exist, must be true whenever I assert it or think it. That I exist, I cannot deny. Or, more popularly stated, I think, therefore I am. Right? This becomes the sort of idea that most of us connect with in that. But Descartes pushes back on from this. What am I? Right? What am I? If I know I am something that's thinking, what am I? Once again, we return to the earlier discussion, where we must cast away all things that can have doubt and build anew. Well then, what did I think that I was? What do I think that I am? How would I answer that question? What do you start with in telling somebody who you are? And not just kind of what you do. This is my job. I'm about this tall, or whatever, right? No, but what are you? Descartes even says a man, right? But what is a man? Shall I say a rational animal? No, for then I should have to ask what an animal is and what rationality is. Each question would lead me to other, still harder ones, and this would take more time than I can spare. Let me focus instead on the beliefs that spontaneously and naturally came to me whenever I thought about what I was. So we're not going to start with the idea that you're a rational animal, as a lot of other philosophers do, right? But what's an animal? What separates an animal from a vegetable from a mineral, right? These are all questions that have fairly easy answers, but yet we still have these as part of our discussion. Right, so he says, I exist. That is certain. But for how long? I don't know how long I will exist, right? None of us do. Life is fleeting and short, right? For as long as I am thinking, though, that is how I can be certain. As long as I am thinking about something, I'm certain that I am. Perhaps no longer than that. For it might be that if I stopped thinking, I would stop existing, which is a fairly big sort of question to have, right? And I have to treat that possibility as though it were actual, because my present policy is to reject everything that isn't necessarily true, right? So he's going to say, you know, well, it might be a bit extreme to think if I'm not thinking anymore, I don't exist. I'm still going to stop and say, all right, as long as I exist only as long as I'm thinking. And that when I stop thinking, I might not very well exist. When you're asleep, you might not exist, etc., right? Strictly speaking, then, I am simply a thing that thinks. A mind or soul or intellect or reason, these being words whose meaning I have only just come to know, he says. Still, I am a real existing thing. What kind of thing? I've answered that. I am a thinking thing. Right? This is the idea that Descartes is really putting forward. What are you? You're a thing that thinks, right? Therefore, what am I? A thing that thinks. What is that? A thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wants, refuses, and also imagines and senses. Right? This becomes the important thing for Descartes, that you are not just I think, therefore I am, but I am because I think. But this becomes the foundation to which he can build everything else off of, that I am a thinking thing. What a thing is, I don't know. But right, it's at least a thing that thinks. In the following, 3 meditations, 3, 4, and 5, he ends up kind of going over and expanding now a little bit on the foundations that he's got, that he is a thing that thinks. He comes to the argument that God truly exists, that a truth truly exists, and indeed also that material things also exist, which is fantastic, because without these, then he couldn't move forward with anything else. So this becomes the sort of foundation, next layer, right? It's the studs for the walls of the building, while the foundation is that he is a thing that thinks. And he kind of goes through long arguments for each of these, but this becomes his sort of conclusion, right? That God and truth and materials all do exist. In Meditation 6, he says, now I've come to the idea that I have senses. If there's a material world and I've got some sort of materiality in this world, I have senses in this world that can see, hear, smell, touch, taste, etc., right? The things around them. And he says it is then reasonable for me to trust them, at least some of the time. Well, we all know that we can be deceived by our senses. We also believe that it is rational, reasonable, to know that sometimes they're giving you accurate things, right? That there is a sensible world around you, and that you have a body which is your own, that it's not somebody else's, it's yours, right? And he says that is because God isn't a deceiver, part of what he got out of the earlier arguments, right? Which implies that he has given me the ability to correct any falsity there may be in my opinions. Indeed, everything that I am taught by nature certainly contains some truth, right? That we're able to look out around, and now this opens the door for some sciences and scientific understanding and exploration, right? That, all right, we threw it away because it was doubtable, at least had some room for doubt. But now we could bring it back in because there are at least some things which are observable and therefore possibly, or in actuality, true. He's also going to advance this by saying that there exist differences between the mind and the body. Right? He says that there's a great difference between these two, whereas the body is by its nature divisible, the mind can't be divided. This line of thought greatly helps me to be aware of the errors to which my nature is liable, and also to correct or avoid them. For I know that there is, so far as bodily well-being is concerned, my senses usually tell the truth. Also, I can usually employ more than one sense to investigate the same thing, and I can get further help from my memory, which connects present experiences with past ones, and from my intellect, which is by now examined all sources of error. So I should have no more fears about falsity of what my senses tell me every day. On the contrary, the exaggerated doubts of those last few days should be dismissed as laughable, which, most of us kind of thought, okay, it's a bit extreme. And now he's saying, I've done it. I've done the heavy lifting. Now, many of those things that had the little bit of doubt and I threw out, I'm like, okay, we can all laugh at that. That's a little bit too much. This applies especially to the chief reason for doubt, namely my inability to distinguish dreams from waking experience. So he concludes finally here at the end of Meditation 6 that there are certain things that we can reaffirm and build back up because we have doubted, right? That because we have doubted, we have reason to know that there are at least some things you can hold on to and proceed from there. The other work we have from Descartes that we're discussing is his discussion on the passions of the soul. Here, the term passions are not really a common term that we use much anymore, except for in very small sort of circles. But the passions are those impulses in us that lead us one way or the other. Those are the things that are natural to all of us, but sometimes kind of control us instead of us controlling them. For Catholics, usually the passions are identified easiest as the seven deadly sins, although, again, each of these has within their beginning something that can do well or harm you, depending on how everything goes. So his discussion here on the passions is very much in line with just kind of religious understanding, but he's trying to figure out how this works within our own mind and how we can move and perceive and understand our own impulses and control our own lives. And again, others will continue to have this discussion. We'll end up having Hume discuss it as well, and we can go back and look at other works that Aquinas did on the idea of the passions of the soul as well, and we can go on to many others who will use this term and discuss it. Even William James is a fairly early example of also discussing this. But here he says, the passions that are aroused in us by the objects that stimulate the sense aren't different for every difference among the objects, but only corresponding to differences in how the objects can harm or benefit us, or, more generally, have importance for us. What's really interesting with Descartes is that his treatment of the passions doesn't begin with the objective impulses themselves, but begins with the subjective, with the individual. Right? What is going to arouse your interest is going to be different than what will arouse mine. You have different impulses, desires. You have different things that you like than I like. You might hear something and it might get you really, really excited, and I might hear the same thing and go, whatever. And you're just going to be like, come on, it's so great. And I'm going to be like, maybe. Right? There's different philosophers or arguments that I hear for the nature of this course and within that discussion that I really like, that you might go, nah, I don't like that one as much, but this other one over here that you didn't quite seem to as engaged in, that's really excited me. And again, all of us are different, and so Descartes kind of begins from the subjective, which is fantastic. Right? What's going to engage you or arouse you or enrage you will be different than it will be for the other people around us. Each of us has different challenges, different interests, so we have different ways we're going to react to the same thing. For Descartes, it is how we see the objects around us. It is about our perception. This is very similar to Socrates and Augustine and Aristotle and Aquinas as well, right? That these other sorts of things exist around us. But really what we're seeing Descartes' argument being built off of is the argument from St. Bonaventure, right, in his work, The Journey of the Mind to God. Right, that sensation is not simply the reception of sensible likeness of material objects to the soul. It is the act whereby the soul, affected by the sense objects, judges it, to definitely use the language of Bonaventure. And Descartes, too, when he's talking about soul here, we're talking about the totality of who you are, as opposed to just your rational intellect, which might be mind and soul, again, become those very confusing and overlapping terms, as again Plato is even talking about the soul, when we might think more of that as the mind, but this connection to those objects around us. Right? Following Bonaventure and Descartes here, right, we judge these objects, these sensations, by the relation of the object to the source of knowledge, that is ultimately with God. For Descartes, our sensations and our judgments of them dictate our passions. What passions do for us is they consist in our will and disposing our soul to those things. And then it decides if it's useful for us, and therefore we persist in it, or it agitates, he says, the agitation of the spirits that normally cause the passions also dispose the body to move in ways that help to bring about those useful things. Right? This becomes the sort of treatment. And again, this is very much following the lines of Bonaventure. But he's, again, starting with the subjective, while Bonaventure kind of addressed this broadly as a universalizing thing. Descartes is talking about individual sensations and how those apply to our passional nature. What's essential for understanding Descartes is that apprehension becomes key to how we will react or judge something. For example, if I was to tell you that tomorrow is going to be the best day of your life, it's probably one of the worst things I could do to you. But if I was able to tell you and was able to convince you that I had, through some sort of, divine revelation or time travel or who knows what, that tomorrow is going to be the best day of your life, and I told you that today, you're going to spend all of tomorrow wondering, is this the good part? Is this the best part? Is this the most exciting part of my day? Is this what he was talking about? And you're going to judge it, and you're going to go, this can't be it, because it's not perfect. It's not extraordinary. It might actually have been the best day of your life, but at the end of the day, you're going to walk and say, that day kind of sucked. I felt miserable. It was a bad day. Why? Because you thought it was going to be so much more exceptional than it was. Objectively speaking, it might have been a fantastic day, and it might have actually been the best day of your life. But when your apprehension is that it's going to be phenomenal, regular or even good doesn't hold up to that standard. Similarly, apprehension could go the other way. If I told you I was going to find you and hit you in the hand with a hammer, you're going to worry about that and be anxious, and we might say rightfully so. And your anxiety and your concerns are going to outweigh possibly even the pain of getting hit in the hand with a hammer. And therefore, the pain that you're suffering and enduring is more. Or you might just say, all right, get it over with, and expecting that it's going to hurt. They go, it wasn't that bad. Right? How we are going to see and perceive and approach things are all going to change what they are in us as well. So again, it's not only just we're going to start from a subjective, but also where you are before that subjective. What sort of apprehension you have about the events and what is known to you. Descartes, in classical Descartes fashion, also gives us an orderly list of the passions, and he's going through, wonder in 53, esteem and contempt in 54, and veneration and scorn in 55. And as you went through and you read these and you saw all of these, you're going to notice that almost every single one of them was a sort of binary, right? There becomes this sort of one end of the spectrum and the other, right? Vainglory and shame, love and hate, veneration and scorn, joy and sadness. Even the ones that are left by themselves, wonder, desire, and remorse, all kind of have this binary character built into them. Right? You may wonder, and it may end up being a good wonder, or your wonder might be a bad wonder, and that can be moved and looked and perceived differently. So it's very interesting to start off with that the passions are this sort of binary that has the same root in the same thing as it moves through and moves forward for Descartes and his conceptions of it. They're all beginning at your middle spot, and then again will either bring you to joy or to sadness, but they have that same root in sensibility, for instance. Descartes advances this by talking about the powers of the soul. Primarily, he begins that the soul has two powers. The power to desire something, right? That where you're going to approach something and you're going to want it. And the power to be annoyed. And some of you are like, that's the one I got, right? But this annoyance, right? In other words, we have the power to want it or not want it. To kind of put it in a more broader way, right? He's going to say from this, the soul also has the powers of wonder, hope, love, and anxiety, and thus the power to receive into itself every other passion and to perform the actions to which the passions impel it. So I don't see, Descartes says, why they have chosen to relate them all to desire or anger, right? This all are some of these other sorts of schools of thoughts on the passions. He's going to say everything can kind of come in here, that it's not just desire and annoyance, but anger and frustration or anything else like that. Everything else can kind of grow out of this. Furthermore, he says it is easy to see that the passions are useful only because they strengthen and prolong thoughts that are good for the soul to have, and which otherwise might be easily wiped out. So the passions have this sort of great strength to them, that they can advance in you something that's good and beneficial. Although, Descartes does point out, when they do harm, because sometimes they do, and traditionally that's usually what people are speaking about the passions was the harm they do. He says that is only because they strengthen and preserve these thoughts beyond what is required, or strengthen and preserve thoughts that it isn't good to give any time to. Right? So this becomes part of that whole issue within the passions as well, that you might be focusing in on and meditating on and just scrutinizing things that are really not that helpful and really should kind of move along and not be important for you. This is really where Descartes wants to somewhat separate notions of passion and your passional nature from obsession, where it brings these ideas beyond what it should be. Right? The passions for Descartes are all the same. Both can be used for good or ill. It's not just about knowledge or ignorance, like we might see others in their treatments of the passions, like Socrates would make this argument, and the Buddha would make another one like this. But it is about our reception of the stimulus that makes it good or evil, following notions of Bonaventure. But the act will be taken differently by different people, and therefore the effects of the passions differ. This is also part of the reason why they're paired. Esteem and contempt, hope and despair. Are they going to help build something up and strengthen something good inside of you as they prolong and linger? Or is it going to move to chaos and ugliness and become notions of obsession? So this becomes part of the fear and the pushback that Descartes wants to discuss within the passions. That we have different ways and different avenues how we might want to see and treat and move within them. That again, it starts from the subjective, but what you're going to do, if you take it too far, the same stimulus could become bad and something that's harmful. So today we talked about Descartes. We talked about the foundations of rationalism and how we're going to approach ideas rationally. What is inside of you that's going to help you know and understand the nature of the universe, the world, yourself. And then we kind of took an introspective turn not on the notion of doubt when we started addressing the role of the passions and Descartes' treatment of the passions, where the sensible world kind of includes things like apprehension. It's not just, does it smell good? But do you apprehend? Do you believe it's going to smell good before you approach it? Are you going to receive it as something that is good? And then, conversely, growing these sorts of ideas and conceptions. So again, rationalism is not just cold and dry. It also tries to look at and include what you'd like and why you like it. What has got value and why it's valuable. So this becomes our discussion. You guys might want to choose to discuss in the discussion groups the role of doubt. What's healthy doubt versus unhealthy doubt? Is there a line of one way or the other? Or do you think instead it's more just about the subjective, right? What might be good for one person is not always going to be apprehended as good for another. Or what's going to excite somebody might not excite another person. And therefore, some of these same ideas that we're going to talk about need to also include at least some value of subjectivity. And yet also we need to understand there are some things that are universal, that I would assume that you are a thing which thinks just as Descartes thought he was a thing that thinks, and I would affirm the same about myself. So again, just food for thought and discussion. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day.